Guys, my name is Randeep Singh Dhillon, and today in this presentation I'm going to talk about climate change, albedo effect and Paris Agreement. Now, so what is climate change in real? Climate change refers to a long-term change in temperature of the Earth's surface, the average weather patterns, precipitation patterns, and its effects on the ecosystem as a whole. Now, what exactly is driving the climate change? It is primarily driven by the increase in the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, which subsequently releases more than the normal amounts of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. Now, what are the main effects of climate change? Global warming, shifting weather patterns, melting of glaciers, and disruption of ecosystem. Now, when we talk about global warming, albedo and albedo effect pops up a lot of times. Now, what exactly is albedo effect and how does it work? Albedo effect is an effect or an expression used to denote the ability of the surface of the earth to reflect the light energy, primarily the sunlight, back to the atmosphere. Now, there are two kinds of albedos, high albedo and low albedo. High albedo. Light colored surfaces reflect back a large amount of sun rays falling on them and hence act as good reflectors, which means they have high albedo. Example of high albedo surfaces are snow, ice, solar panels, glass, etc. Low albedo. Dark surfaces absorb a large amount of sun rays falling on them and hence act as a good absorbers, which means they have low albedo. Example of low albedo surfaces, bare grounds, forests, etc. Now the main difference is that high albedo surfaces act as good reflectors and low albedo surfaces they act as good absorbers. Now here's a diagram explaining how does albedo effect work. As you can see, this is a light colored surface, this is a dark colored surface. Sun rays falling on the light colored surface, the surface reflects most of the solar radiation out into the space, whereas when the sunlight falls on dark colored surface, most of the solar radiation is absorbed and re-emitted in the form of infrared radiation. Now here's the catch. The infrared radiation is absorbed and re-emitted by the greenhouse gas. The direct effect of this is warming of Earth's lower atmosphere and the surface. Now, how does climate change affect basically what are the effects of climate change on albedo? The Earth's albedo has been decreasing for decades now. The average albedo of the Arctic regions contributing to the global warming has been reduced by 1.5% per decade. Low albedo means more warmer regions on the Earth. Global warming means sea ice and lowers the average snowfall on the Earth, which has subsequently led to more dark surfaces such as bare grounds than the shiny snowy surfaces which have high reflective properties. So basically global warming melts the snow and ice which are high reflecting surfaces and it exposes a bare ground beneath snow and ice which have lower reflective properties. As less energy is reflected out to the space and more stays on the Earth, this causes an increase in the heat staying on the Earth. With the time the cycle repeats itself, albedo of the Earth gets lowered even more, thus disturbing the flora and fauna of the ecosystem. Now, the 2015 Paris Agreement was the first instance of countries willing to take a collective action against global warming. Now, what is Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement is an international treaty signed to address the effects of climate change. It was signed on 12 December 2015 at the 21st conference at the United Nations Framework Convention Center held in Paris, France. Now, what are the objectives of this agreement? The main objective of this agreement is to limit the global warming below 2 degrees Celsius with an ideal target of limiting it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. NDC, nationally determined contributes, is a framework submitted by the participating countries that outline the measures taken by the nation to address the issue of raising greenhouse gases. Now, countries under the agreement are required to report on their emissions and progress in implementing the NDC in a transparent way to UN. As you can see, there is no way of regulating how the countries are reducing their emissions. Now, one of the biggest pros of this agreement is to provide financial aid to the developing countries from the developed countries to mitigate the effects of global warming. Now let's talk about some of the, as you can see, world leaders posing for a picture while they were at the Paris Agreement conference. Now the question arises, is it really working? Is Paris Agreement really working? One of the biggest cons of this agreement is that it lacks a mechanism that enforces the targets set by the countries, and it solely relies on voluntary compliance of the nations. So there is no set of mechanisms or targets given by the Paris Agreement which countries can follow up. Further, the NDC submitted by some of the nations is not sufficient enough to achieve the agreement's laid out temperature goals, that is 2 degrees Celsius and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, some of the critics have also pointed out that the agreement states the regulations in a very vague language. The language is not clear and precise. The language used is very vague, which can be interpreted and implemented in a number of ways by the countries, which may not be in sync with the goals set out by the agreement. Now finally, let's talk about some of the mitigating steps that can be adopted. Now, one of the biggest steps that we as an individual can take is carbon pricing mechanisms such as carbon taxes or cap and trade system, which can be an effective method to incentivize the emission reductions. Reforestation will help plants to absorb excess of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and thus helping to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, there's one more point. Reforestation also helps in decreasing the albedo. Now, there is no doubt that forests have low albedos, as trees are expert in capturing sun's energy, but research suggests that in tropical areas, forests do a great job at balancing their low albedo with evaporation, which in turn cools the atmosphere and thus bringing down the average global temperature. Transition to electric transport can help reduce the burning of petroleum to run the vehicles, which will further reduce the emission of harmful petroleum products into the air. Sustainable agriculture is another effective measure that can be adopted to reduce the emissions from agriculture. It can be seen that reducing the emission in the environment of harmful gases can solely be an effective method of reducing the global warming, which in turn can help maintain the albedo effect of the Earth. This in turn helps the Paris Agreement to achieve its goal. And as you can see, these are some of the targets set out by Paris Agreement till 2050. And that's all for me. Thanks.